So after spending the better part of an hour making my beautiful self-insert and having to pick from quite literally 100 eyebrow choices and what is an extremely impressive character creator, it was off to the races in Code Vein, an anime Souls-like developed by Bandai Namco, released back in 2019. Let's get the obvious out of the way first. Code Vein is an extremely anime-y game, and there's no denying it, and it speaks for itself. And not surprisingly, the story is also pretty anime-esque as well. Code Vein is more story-driven than most Souls-likes I have played, or at least it does less of the environmental storytelling thing that most others do, complete with tons of long cutscenes where most of the story is told here in this game. That said, the story here in Code Vein is like many of these anime games in that it over-convolutes basic premises or narratives. And here in Code Vein, the basic story is that revenants, which are basically just vampires, are dying out in this post-apocalyptic world because they have to consume blood, yes, literal blood, to survive, and blood fruits, which are called blood beads, are running out, and the human population is running thin. And your character is essentially the chosen one who has to uncover the secrets of the world and try to save the Revenant race. So yeah, while I wouldn't say that the story is a complete Dark Souls copy, Code Vein definitely drew inspiration from it to craft its background conflict, and some of the other story stuff is pretty derivative of other works. And along the way, you make a variety of different friends who join your cause, with some partners being more interesting and involved in the plot than others, but I would say that there was at least an attempt by the developers to make most of the partners appealing or useful in different contexts, even if they were not successful. And yeah, I mean, without getting too much more into the story, I do want to highlight that there are at least 3 major endings, and the narrative success or failure of your character's mission is directly tied to how you handle the successors in the game, who basically function just like the sages did in Ocarina of Time. Also, I found Nicola's subplot to be very similar to Emil's from Nier, and hell, I think they might even share the same voice actor. Alright, turning to Code Vein's gameplay, I mean, it's a Souls-like. The combat is meant to be punishing and to disincentivize button mashing. Also, you'll need to employ basic strategies such as trying to carefully pull a trash mob or patrol from chaining ads from a larger group. Bosses, of course, are the big draw here, and with the exception of the final boss as well as some of the special chalice dungeon approximations, which are called depths here, bosses are tough, but they rarely feel like they're actually unfair. You just have to learn their patterns and develop a strategy to beat them. In fact, in a similar vein, I think that the game is most difficult in its first hours as you are adjusting to the system and are still learning how the game plays, but after about 8 hours or so, the game loses a lot of that difficult edge, and by the time my character hit level 60 or so, I would further say that the game almost became easy simply because my character's damage output just absolutely skyrocketed, although she could only take maybe 6 or so hits before dying, so I never felt like my character was overpowered, but I definitely can see that the game overall becomes easy as you are playing through it. I stuck with wielding a two-handed sword for almost the entire game, which normally isn't my weapon of choice, but it felt really good here because when the sword actually lands into an enemy, it felt very crunchy, and it also would usually stagger them as well. By comparison, some of the other weapon types, like the bayonet, for example, felt kind of underwhelming. And that reminds me, actually, stamina is always the limiting factor in this game. Even with stamina boost passives, you really can only get maybe a few swings of any weapon before stamina is depleted. And I mean, there is some gameplay variety with the codes, which are just really a fancy name for jobs or classes, and gifts, which are just an equally fancy name for skills and abilities, but most of these fulfill the traditional and archetypal RPG roles. Some of the codes definitely feel straight better than others, but I will say the game at least encourages you as the player to experiment with all of the codes, because as you use a code, you unlock the ability to have that code's gifts, either active or passive, be used in another code. Alright, some negatives about the game I want to mention. First, there are these many and frequent memory scenes that are just flashbacks to pad out largely sub-stories and character arcs, but many of them are not especially interesting, to say charitably, and a lot of them are just straight up way too drawn out. But thankfully, most of them are skippable. Also, the gameplay itself has a lot of these linear maps overall, but Code Vein does throw the occasional, where the hell am I supposed to go thing at you. And I'm reminded most notably of the Anor Londo knockoff, which is called Cathedral of the Sacred Blood here in this game. But at least in the game, the NPCs kind of nudge you in the right direction if you listen to them. Oh, and speaking of NPCs, there is an NPC invasion mechanic which plays a lot like the invasions from the Dark Souls series. It's just not as fun or as interesting here. And speaking of which, I tried and failed on multiple times to try to play multiplayer, but unfortunately because the game is old and dead, nobody's really playing this anymore. Just to touch briefly on the art direction of Code Vein, outside the obvious anime and cel-shaded art, the rest of the game tends to be gothic and even a little bit grungy. But even still, there's a lot of using the whole color palette here, but I would say that the brown colors tend to dominate, and after a few hours, Code Vein does sort of exhaust my eyes a little bit. And the music is pretty good here, or at least when it wants to be. Otherwise, it's just mostly a bunch of forgettable BGMs, although I will say that the Memory of the Lost track is definitely overplayed. So bringing this to a conclusion, Code Vein is like most of Bandai Namco's other anime games, like the Tales of series and Scarlet Nexus, which I've said for years at this point, they're all serviceable games, yes, in that you're generally not in danger of playing a real stinker, but you're also not as likely to play a real gem either. With all of that said, I would say that Code Vein is a good game, but it doesn't do anything particularly novel or groundbreaking, and I think that a B/B- is appropriate here. If nothing else, Bandai Namco Studios made a good foundational game, and they can only improve from here, right guys?